Welcome to the podcast series Inclusive Research and Innovation in Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics. My name is Claudia Werker and I'm an associate professor at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. I host this podcast series on IRI in STEM. Today I'm happy to welcome Mara Tanelli. Mara is a full professor in automatic control at Politecnico Milano, as well as her rector's delegate for diversity and inclusion. For full disclosure, Mara and I are both members of the Idea Leaks working group on gendered and inclusive research and innovation and have been working together on this topic in the past. But today I will talk to Mara about her research and how she contributes by it to inclusive research and innovation. Welcome, Mara. Perhaps start by telling us about your professional background and your research and innovation activities.
My background is that of a computer engineer that was specializing in control and automation. I started my research in the automotive sector as an expert on vehicle control. Later on, this developed into the design of mobility systems, so at a higher level of abstraction, using data to model behaviors and to make choices, let's say, in the smart mobility sectors. Then a few years ago, after I started also my institutional involvement in diversity and inclusion, which followed my personal civic engagement about human rights, gender equality, and the like, I really reasoned a lot on how I could merge my research interests with my more individual engagement and values. And reasoning on that, I understood how many technologies that have final users who are individuals actually overlooked this part, these diversity variables, the socioeconomic identities of individuals. And this overlooking often led to many mistakes in the design and wasted occasions in the development of the technology. And so I started working on inclusive mobility, so to bridge my civic engagement into the field in which I was more expert in a technical sense.
Could you tell us a bit more about how that actually translated into tangible research and innovation activities?
Yes, what I tried to conceive was a framework for design of inclusive technology solutions, especially in the mobility sector. And so let's say that the research work develops along three main pillars. The first pillar tries to study the drivers that lead to the adoption of a new technology. So most often, the technical quality of the product or service is not enough to explain why it is widely adopted or not. This is particularly true in sustainable mobility context. For example, think of the spread of electric vehicles or the spread of sharing services. Up to now, the maturity in the technical sense of this type of solutions is quite wide and well established, yet the spread that they have in our society is still quite limited. And one of the reasons why this is true is that in the conceptual development of the technology, the fact that social and individual characteristics have a say in the decision of adopting this technology is not so well understood and studied. And so we tried to conceive a quantitative framework based on the analysis of data that mainly come from surveys. And we tried to single out, using machine learning approaches and data analytics algorithms, we tried to define which is what we call the mobility DNA, so the main features that lead individuals to be positive or negative in the adoption of this type of technologies. And so we build this sort of compact indicators that allow you to evaluate each single individuals along these different features and understand how these features relate to their willingness in adopting the technologies. Then once you have understood this first pillar, what we do is to build social networks. Again, in a mathematical sense, these social networks are actually fully connected graphs in which each node is an agent. So it's an individual that you have been studying, as I previously mentioned. And you basically model the fact that besides individual inclinations, our decisions are widely influenced by the people we live with, and so the connections in our social networks. So the connections are established, again, in a data-driven fashion, actually by modeling the homophily that humans are subject to. So trying to model the fact that we actually are more influenced by persons to which we feel to be close in some sense or the other. So we might be close by many different reasons, because we live nearby and so we meet in our actual lives. We might be close because we have a similar environmental awareness, because we have a similar degree of study. And so you can construct these social networks connecting individuals by virtue of these different types of relationships that they can have with each other. Once you have built this network, this is a mathematical object that can be numerically simulated. And so you can discover which is the dynamics of your adoption. So starting from individuals that are initially positively or negatively inclined, you can see how the personal relationships can alter this initial inclination and lead different persons to adopt the technology. Once you have done this, you can also leverage the network to design and test policies that can foster adoption. If you think of the context of sustainable mobility, of course, governments across the world are trying to propose policies that foster the adoption of this kind of technology, because if massively adopted, they can be a means to mitigate climate change and so to have other positive effects on the society as a whole. And so we believe that if you have the same, let's say, mathematical setting and simulation setting in which to test different policies, then of course you have a means to understand beforehand whether these policies can be effective or not. And in this specific context of policy design, we are also trying to reason on how we can engineer these policies so that they can embed social justice concepts. So, of course, this type of policies apply to a very diverse population. So we believe that unless you consider these diversity variables in your policy design, you might result in having unfair policies. For example, in the context of electric vehicles, price policies are often made, so everybody receives the same discount when buying an electric vehicle. So of course, this is rather unfair. And so we tried to understand how concepts such as equity, equality, can be transformed in mathematical elements that construct a cost function that can be optimized in order to understand and to potentially show to the policymaker how considering this type of elements of social justice within an engineering framework can make you understand how the concept of performance can be redefined also in the light of these social elements.
If I now would zoom in to discuss the diversity of human beings, how does this play a role in your research?
So the diversity of the human beings, we tried to understand in a so-called intersectional framework. So each of us is the result of the intersection of many diversity variables. For example, in my case, my age, my gender, my family status, educational degree, where I live, my ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So basically, we try to extract this intersectional view from data. Of course, you have to have access to data, but many policymakers are yearly or anyway with a specific update rate making many surveys in different populations in Europe, but also across the world to inquire about technological habits and in particular about mobility habits. So the idea is to be able of reading this data, valuing these variables that define the identity of an individual as the result of all the diversity variables that make their socioeconomic identity. Putting these results together with the, let's say, more technical related preferences and habits, that is what is usually employed by engineers. So the idea is to try and bridge this, technical view of individuals with the diversity-related picture and understand that, or show and prove using data that it's only with the combinations of both that you can make the technology design more socially just, but also it's a matter of efficiency and ability to come out with solutions that are actually widely adopted.
Could you give an example how this kind of diversity intersectionality indicator would influence the kind of technological result you are providing?
For example, in some of the works that we did, we found that the mobility DNA of individuals that related to the adoption of electric vehicles is a lot related with the environmental awareness, with place of living, with age, with income level of the family. And so you see that many of these variables, who are actually variables that we commonly employ to define diversity in a social manner, have a say in the technical decisions, in this case, in the decision of whether to buy or not an electric vehicle or an hybrid vehicle.
You also did work about the influence of gender on the use of public transport. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on that?
Yes. Here the idea was to understand how gender interplayed with the choice or with the possibility of exploiting public transport instead of private solutions. Of course, this has to do with the so-called modal shift. So the fact that sustainable mobility not only comes from the substitutions of internal combustion engines with green solutions, so electric vehicles or hybrid electric vehicles, but also comes from the change in behaviors. So the fact that many people substitute private transportations, which is in general more energy consuming, with public solutions. This, of course, is not only a gender-related issue, but gender variable has a lot to do with it, because, let's say, analyzing data that model the way in which women move with respect to men, for example, when going to work, shows that while men generally enter and exit the city by means of the main road arteries, women do what is called chain traveling. So they complete their going from A to B, where A can be home and B can be the workplace, by putting together many different and short moves that, for example, are used to bring the kids to school, stop to the groceries, go and see all their parents, and so on. And of course, if you think of modeling times and routes of a public transport on these very different mobility habits, then maybe the usual design way on which the routes and the time availability of public transports are shaped could be gender responsive, but only towards one of the genders. And so you can see in this way how disaggregating data, so how reading data highlighting diversity variables, gender in this case, could really, let's say, disclose important information that can be valued in order to make proposals that are fair in the meaning that they are gender equal in the response they give to different genders' mobility need that everybody has.
It's a great example of how taking into consideration specific aspects of the individuals moving around play a huge role. But perhaps in more general terms, what would be the coolest results to achieve in your research and innovation? So if you could choose to do whatever you like and you would achieve what you want to, what would that be?
That's a very difficult question. I think that my goal would be really to be able of discussing and presenting this type of results to policymakers. So the lessons that you can learn from, as I was saying before, for example, with the gender dimension, disaggregating and analyzing data that are disaggregated with respect to different diversity variables, and also to show how considering fairness and social justice in decision making can be integrated into contexts that are generally conceived only in a technical way. So when the bridge is done between performance and costs, performance is never only framed too much outside of the common economical way of measuring resources, but how resources can be defined in a broader sense, encompassing social justice, and how the integration of these concepts can lead and frame a completely new way of using resources and understanding the value that these investments can have at a more general level. So being able of bringing my research to a level of understanding that can be then transmitted also to and accessed through interactions with policymakers, I think it would be my aim.
So you are looking for not only into the technical solutions and their economic values, but to go beyond the economic values and look into social values of all kinds, and to consider them sufficiently so that you can communicate your results to policymakers so that they can make an informed decision. Is that about what you are looking for?
Yes, this is what I'm looking for. So for now, we have framed an initial part of the work in a technical manner in our discipline. So to show that inserting this type of elements in an optimization problem doesn't destroy the properties of the optimizer, quantifying how the performance change, finding KPIs that can explain this shift of meaning of performance, again, in a technical manner. So what I hope is that when this is established and also accepted by the scientific community, which is also another thing, because you know that also in the scientific communities, things that go a bit beyond the technical side can be well received or not well received. So this is another aspect. But then being able to elaborate from the technical part and distill some broader lessons that can be then transmitted by trying to facilitate some relationships that can go beyond the technical community so that they can be discussed at, I would say, political level, and to see whether this kind of discourse can be actually fruitful.
Leads nicely up to my next question. As you obviously have to work with a lot of people outside your own academic discipline, even outside the university as such. So could you give us an overview with which kind of people, which kind of disciplines you are working together with to achieve what you want to achieve?
Yes. So first of all, as you mentioned, we tried to enlarge our research group to encompass colleagues from the social sciences. In particular, I collaborate actively here in Politecnico di Milano with a colleague, Professor Viola Schiaffonati, who is a philosopher of science. We have started together a PhD that is actually being taken by a girl who graduated in philosophy. And then she started this PhD in Politecnico di Milano along, let's say, a more quantitative track. And she's working together with us and with our PhD students from more technical backgrounds in order to help us to correctly frame in the social context these elements such as equity, justice, fairness, because then our goal is to show that they can be translated into quantitative elements and analyzed within an engineering context. But the initial definition and the correct placing of this context in the society, of course, must be done with colleagues that have such competencies. And we are also perceiving that this enlargement of views and learning process that we have to reciprocally take in order to understand each other and to fruitfully collaborate also helps a lot in refining and cleaning the concepts that you are trying to conceive. Of course, outside, we are trying to leverage also our institutional relationship with the public administrators at the level of the city or of the region, in order to start interacting with public authorities and have initial discussions on how these efforts that come from the scientific communities are perceived. Because the first building block of making this, let's say, this new perspective pervasive and applicable is the help of policymakers and administrators in collecting data in a disaggregated way. Because most often they recognize the fact that this would bring value, but collecting data, for example, in the city of Milano, they collect a lot of data about the mobility habits of the citizens, but the socioeconomic variables that you can associate to each mobility users are very few, if not non-existent. And so you would have a lot of input sources, but you lose the ability of reading them through this diversity lens. This, of course, has to do with privacy up to some point, but there are, of course, well-thought ways in which you can bridge the need to know something about the individual and the legitimate privacy issues. But I think unless you disclose how much value is behind this ability of reading diversity, people who are in the position of making this disaggregated data gathering process into place will fail to see why they should do it, maybe questioning a bit about privacy. And so I think that our role is to show them that in cases in which this is possible, then the value is a lot.
You can also anonymize these kinds of data anyway. I mean, so that you still have the categories of the people regarding their diversity and intersectionality without anyone being able to link to the actual person what they have been saying. So we have been doing quite some work on that as well. And I don't think that this is really a problem. But of course, I can imagine that convincing people who are not familiar with that is another issue.
Yeah, the partial anonymization process that you can, of course, rather easily take. But of course, if you ask citizens to change the way in which you ask information, for example, about their mobility, and they see you asking questions that pertain to their private life, you must be ready and willing to explain and to show why you are asking. So it's not to intrude, but it's rather to design fairer systems that they can benefit of. But of course, this is a process, and you have to have the political will to initiate this process and to go for participative ways of interactions with the community. And so, of course, this takes resources, time, and must be backed by political will.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, we do that as well. And usually, at least with the people who we are interviewing in that way or asking to fill in surveys, we guarantee that we will always have at least 20 people of the same kind of categories before we actually say something in a public report, so that never, ever anyone can say, okay, this is that person they are talking about. Because I can, of course, completely understand that people are worried about that. But certainly, if you talk about public transport in larger cities, you are easily having more than 20 people with the same kind of categorization. So that shouldn't be a problem in practical terms. But yeah, in political terms, that is a different matter. So it was really great talking to you. I have a last question for you, and that is actually, given our conversation, did I forget to ask you something that you would rather like to share with us?
There is a last thing that I would like to share, that also on this research and on the internal dissemination of this research in Politecnico di Milano. Last year, we started a Master of Science course, which is called Diversity Aware Design of Technology Solutions, which is inserted in the, let's say, transversal skills that are offered to the students of all engineering courses here in Politecnico di Milano, that are designed to broaden a bit the traditional study plan of our engineering students. And the course is co-taught by myself for the technical part and by a colleague who is a sociologist here in Politecnico di Milano. And so we experiment a mix also in class of a more humanity-driven type of teaching with then the more technical part. And it's really nice. Also, it's a nice experience to interact with students, exchanging opinions and discussing, which is something you don't really do in technical studies. And of course, this course is of interest for a small amount of students. So we've been having like 50 to 60 students. But those who come are really interested and really appreciate this, let's say, contamination of knowledge, which I think that is really the key to address the future of technology, because technology is pervading individual lives with repercussions that we sometimes fail to grasp. And so I think that understanding and discussing with engineers this interplay between human factors, social justice, and technology is something that should happen more and more in the future.
Very happy to hear that you are experimenting with courses on the bridge between social sciences and the humanities and engineering, as we do as well. So we might be talking more about that, but this is a bit beyond this podcast. So thank you once again, Mara, for sharing with us your experiences with inclusive research and innovation.
Thanks to you for having me.